Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to speak tonight to the Friends of Ecological Reserves in key biodiversity areas. I know some of you are already familiar with the program. It's a new concept to others, and I look forward to providing a background to what KBAs are, what they are not, as well as an update on progress and how they complement BC's network of ecological reserves. I'd like to start off tonight in the Okanagan Valley, Trout Creek Ecological Reserves. Like many others in the province, it's relatively small, unassuming, rarely visited, about 75 hectares in area. It was one of the first ERs established in the province in 1971. In fact, this is the James Bond of ecological reserves because it's ER number 007. It was established to conserve representative semi-arid vegetation dominated by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir in the Okanagan Valley. It's just outside Summerlin, BC. Species there, there we go. Species there, you expect to find things that are fairly common. This out of the way. Blue bunch wheatgrass, of course, rough fescue, common grasses, the grasslands, open forests, bitterroot, balsam, arrowleaf balsam root. There's some 130 other or more other plant species that are there. Typical grassland species at risk are there too: badgers, rattlesnakes, gopher snakes, yellow-bellied racers, nighthawk, and others. Also occurring there, though, is this rather unassuming, somewhat scraggly plant, woody pod milkvetch, also known as the doll's milkvetch or Astragalus sclerocarpus. It's a typical milkvetch, narrow, compound leaves, sort of lemony yellow, fairly relatively plain bloom, and the characteristic seed pods that generate on it that are fairly thick. Astragalus sclerocarpus has fairly limited distribution in Canada. It's only in the arid Great Basin ecosystem that is found in the South Okanagan. It's found only in the Chapaka-Kilpoola area that is west of Osoyoos, south of Highway 3, around the Skaha Lake area, south of Penticton, and at Trout Creek Ecological Reserve, north of Penticton. In all, the BC Conservation Data Center reports there's no more than 10 localized occurrences or element occurrences. At least 3 of those are just historic records that are now likely under vineyards or an orchard. Woody pod milkvetch is also so unassuming that it is not listed by the Conservation Data Center, nor is it assessed by CSIWIC, that a national scientific body that assesses all species and taxa at risk in Canada. The US ranks it, the NatureServe ranks it impaired nationally in Canada. If you're familiar with NatureServe rankings, that's an N2 ranking. Along with the limited distribution in Canada, this is sufficient to qualify Trout Creek Ecological Reserve as a key biodiversity area. So what exactly is a key biodiversity area? They are sites that contribute to the persistence of biodiversity both nationally and globally, is our standard definition. They are found across land, water, marine environments. They support rare and threatened species and ecosystems, as well as key natural processes. They range in size from small patches of habitat to large tracts of land or water. They're designated based on specific measurable criteria that undergo extensive review. The result is a scientifically robust, credible tool that captures a wide range of biodiversity values. They're widely accepted as an important tool for informing a range of conservation actions, from identifying possible protected areas, highlighting sites that support species in need of mindful stewardship. The KBA designation does not invoke management prescription. It does not provide any protected status, nor does it impact access to land or water. It is strictly an information layer. They're also not negotiated. It either meets the criteria or it doesn't. Ultimately, it's a very grassroots system process that are identified, developed locally, but ultimately approved by either national or global secretariat to ensure that the consistent criteria are met. They're guided by the species and ecosystems ecology, so there's no limit to size, either big or small, within the scale of the trigger species. We have some KBAs that are literally urban parks, small urban Gary Oak fragments in city parks in Victoria, up to thousands, tens of thousands of square kilometers. KBAs are blind to land status, so they may encompass private land, public land, indigenous lands, sometimes overlapping either partially or entirely, either a legally protected area. And once completed, the spatial area layers and supporting information are all publicly available, so the KBA can be effectively used in land and water management actions and research. KBAs were launched in 2016 by the IUCN and partners after several years of developing a global standard. As a result of extensive consultations with experts to consolidate criteria and methodology for identifying what constitutes a KBA. A lot of this arose out of the important bird area network that BirdLife International had, important amphibian reptile areas, butterfly areas. There's a number of different systems that were identified around the world, and KBA sought to bring all of those together under one umbrella. Canada is the first country to adopt our own national standard, which is strongly based on the global one. The main difference is that our national standard accepts elements to the infraspecies level, subspecies, varieties, populations, etc., that are deemed to be of national importance. Both these standards are the backbone of KBAs. The KBA in Canada is a KBA in Ghana, is a KBA in Australia. They may identify quite different things, but they all meet the same criteria. Ultimately, KBAs are a non-global initiative. A national secretariat in Canada oversees the program, with key members being Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada, who I work for, Birds Canada, and NatureServe Canada. These are the lead organizations. Also, conservation organizations like Nature Conservancy of Canada, World Wildlife Fund sit on the secretariat. The federal government, ECCC, Environment Climate Change Canada, sits on the secretariat as an observer, but does not have a say in what is or is not become a key biodiversity area. So we'll take a look at how this works. There's 5 main criteria for meeting the KBA designation, and all of these have subcategories. I'll touch on a few. All species are potentially eligible for a key biodiversity area. Any site that supports 10% of individuals, range, or area of occupancy, or other assessment parameters is potentially a KBA. This would be criterion B. As species become more endangered, such as this Victoria owl's clover, the form that grows in the capital region, as shown under criterion A in the upper left, the threshold drops. So the more threatened the species, the lower the threshold. There we are, criterion. For example, species that are critically endangered or endangered by IUCN need only 5.5% of the population to be present to qualify as a KBA. Species that are CSIWIC endangered need only 0.5%. And species that are either global 1, G1, or N1 need only 0.5% of the population present to qualify as a KBA. Species can also qualify for more than one criterion. Our woody pod milkvetch at Trout Creek is listed nationally imperiled by NatureServe as or N2, and the ecological reserve represents well over 10% of its national range as measured by the number of localities. So the Trout Creek Ecological Reserve meets both A1 and B1 criteria as a KBA. Ecosystems are also eligible for KBA status. They must meet similar thresholds to qualify. Criterion, to pause briefly there for how ecosystems are mapped differs across provinces, across the country, and currently mapping ecosystems in BC is being figured out between NatureServe process systems and how the Conservation Data Center maps ecosystems. Many of you might be familiar with ecological communities that are red and blue listed in BC. Those are not necessarily consistent with NatureServe ecosystems mapping, and we're working that out. Criterion D here, biological processes, identifies sites such as demographic aggregations, ecological refuge, or recruitment sources. Examples might include bat hibernacula, seabird aggregations, particularly on the coast, migratory staging grounds, fish spawning sites. These also have population thresholds that must be met, so that every abandoned mine shaft with a few hibernating bats is not going to meet criteria. In all, there are several ways to get to KBA status, and as mentioned, the site can meet more than one criteria. If you're interested in more, I'm happy to get into the nitty-gritty details. on our own, but we'll leave it at that for this overview. So how do we identify sites? We have an extensive database that's maintained by NatureServe Canada that compiles occurrence data from numerous sources, such as conservation data centers, iNaturalist, academic studies, museum records, other available sources. Sites that meet thresholds are identified, and we can document that the species is extant. It has reliable information to support that it meets thresholds. The line work, we then delineate the boundaries using line work that is ecologically based as much as possible. They focus on where the species or ecosystems is known to occur. The sites must have extant species there. So where a species has disappeared from a site or winked out is not going to be eligible as a KBA. The proposals then undergo extensive review by experts, knowledge holders, rights holders, stakeholders. The work is often slow and additive. Multiple opportunities to add knowledge to make sure we get things right are included along the way. And hopefully by the time we get to the end product, we have a strong support for the key biodiversity area. My work is primarily in well, all of this, but the proposal, the create proposal process is where I take all the data that is available, collate that together and prepare a report that is available for external review. So why should we do this? Why bother with KBAs? The quick answer is because they're needed. Questions are inevitably raised of what's the point if sites and their values are not protected? If it's already in a protected area or park as a conservation vehicle, why bother? The main value is as a globally recognized, scientifically robust recognition that the site meets standardized criteria and thresholds for conservation importance. They go beyond species or ecosystems at risk. They go beyond the charismatic megaflora and megafauna that capture so much of our focus and conservation dollars. From moss to moose, KBAs are sites of disproportionate importance to the persistence of all national and global biodiversity. You may be familiar with Aldo Leopold, who said the first part of intelligent tinkering is saving all the parts. KBAs help us recognize where those parts are. Their objective, apolitical foundation on robust science and information makes them reliable to all sources, from government to industries to NGOs. So who's interested in these? Federal government is looking to KBAs as an important information source for their Pathway to Canada Target 1 objective. They're also a major information source for the commitment to protect 30% of both land and marine areas by 2030, the 30 by 30 initiative. Outreach and partnerships with First Nations is an important part of the KBA process, particularly important in BC where most lands are unceded. To date, we've had very positive interest and support for KBAs from most of the nations and communities that we have met with. KBAs are being used as an information source to support Indigenous protected and conserved areas, identify important ecological values in their territories. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, are also interested in KBAs to support their work. In many cases, the areas are already known to them, and the KBA designation can provide some unbiased affirmation of importance at site, whether it's for land securement or more general conservation initiatives. They are also using it as information source as to where they should put their securement dollars. Provincially, BC also has a 30 by 30 commitment. Like the federal government, KBAs KBAs also 30 by 30 commitments. Like the federal government, KBAs provide part of the roadmap to reach that goal. The recent mandate letters to Minister of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship in particular highlights the imperative to protect and enhance BC's biodiversity. KBAs will help identify where that is needed most. They fit well into other provincial initiatives too, including provinces' modernized land use planning process, movement to improve species at risk stewardship. And at the local government level, KBAs are an ideal information layer for official community plans and other land use planning efforts. So with the help of many people across the province and beyond, we've made pretty good progress in BC. To date, more than 200 KBAs have been identified and either are complete or in the process of development or review. Part of the KBA process has been migration of important bird areas to the KBA umbrella where they meet KBA thresholds. Most IBAs in BC do meet these. The work is ongoing to update information. Many of these sites have non-avian triggers as well that meet criteria, such as Morrison Creek lamprey at Comox, northern leopard frogs, and Kootenai white sturgeon at Creston. This information is available on our website. There's a map viewer at kbacanada.org. A note here that the default view of the online map shows only the green complete KBAs. If you pulling up this map and looking for more information, click on the candidate key biodiversity areas in the lower right-hand corner to populate the map with several of these orange dots. These are the centroids of draft KBAs. Clicking on each of these will pull up information about each of the KBA species that are involved with it. Due to the extensive review process, 8 sites have been completed or published to date in BC, while there are 78 sites or more finalized across Canada. These are Trial Islands, just off Oak Bay at Victoria, one that was the first KBA completed in Canada. Fort Rod Hill, National Historic Site that recognizes deltoid balsam root and McCown's meadow foam. The Fraser River Estuary, very large legacy IBA in the lower mainland, has numerous species as well as numerous bird species that use the area for staging and overwintering in particular, and also a number of non-avian species such as night stalking beetle in Boundary Bay beaches and a bog spider in Burns Bog. There is Tofino mudflats on Vancouver Island partially within Pacific Rim National Park that is for mostly migratory birds, particularly western sandpiper. The Mackenzie Pemberton KBA recognizes the coast mountain population of sharp-tailed snake. This is the only location of sharp-tailed snake on the mainland within Canada. Little Quarry Lake has benthic and limnetic stickleback pairs. There's a number of these stickleback pairs up and down in the coast. They will all be eventually KBAs. This is the first one to be fully completed. Over in our part of the province, Yakitignukhayet, or Tobacco Plains Indian Reserve, is the only place in Canada with Spalding's campion, and is one of our first KBAs in Canada that had full agreement with the chief and council at Yakitignukhayet. And most recently, which I don't have on the map here, but that's Yatay which is the Atlin Warm Springs up in the northwest part of the corner. It has a lake chub population that is adapted to that Warm Springs area. It is in the Taku River band area. So ecological reserves and KBAs are a great fit as both seek to identify special biodiversity values. Special natural species and ecosystems, rare endangered plants and animals, unique, rare, or outstanding phenomena are all very similar language to the KBA thresholds. Of course, there are differences. Not all ecological reserves will be KBAs due to the criteria and thresholds in the national and global scope of the program, whereas ecological reserves are provincial. But they complement each other very well with lots of common ground in their objectives. Ecological reserves and KBAs are a great fit as they both seek to identify these special biodiversities. Currently, there are 12 KBAs, 13 KBAs drafted that cover all or part of our 16 or 17 ecological reserves, 17 ecological reserves. This does not include Haida Gwaii, where we're currently working with the Council of Haida Nation local organizations to figure out the existing important bird areas and the myriad of unique biodiversity values at Haida Gwaii. Every ecological reserve on Haida Gwaii will eventually be in a key biodiversity area. Whether those are separate key biodiversity areas or one large key biodiversity area that covers the entire of Haida Gwaii archipelago remains to be seen. They complement. There's a good chance that the entire archipelago will be recognized. Now you can help too. Trout Creek has benefited greatly from the wisdom and information of grasslands ecologist Don Gayton, and many other people have been essential for identifying key biodiversity areas around the province. Most of you probably worked with species or ecosystems that have KBA opportunities. Data, information, expertise can help ensure that the key biodiversity areas reflect the most up-to-date knowledge. Opportunities include providing technical reviews for species and areas with which you're familiar, help us ensure that KBAs are accurate and realistic. And we readily acknowledge that there are many sites that we don't know about. These are our known unknowns. If there are species or areas that you think are worthwhile to consider for KBA criteria and thresholds, please reach out and let us know. I'd be happy to meet with any of you. So I want to thank you for your time and attention, and happy to take any questions if there are any. Thanks.
So we only have about 20 people here. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask it. Don't worry about putting up hands or anything.
I'd like to start off with a question. And that is, I'm surprised that of the 148 ecological reserves, there are only, what was it, 17 that you mentioned that have qualified. Does this mean that the others haven't been looked at, or do they have to be recommended by somebody? And that's one part of my question, yes?
Sure. In part, they haven't looked at it. We scope out the KBAs two different, or the sort of a top-down and a bottom-up type of approach. The top-down is using our database that said this is the species where we know of that occur there, or where do they occur in sufficient abundance that they meet the criteria and thresholds. Bottom-up would be, hey, what about this area? Does it meet it? And that way we can look at it, and what data we have that are available, that are information that is there, does it meet the criteria? So I have not gone ER by ER around the province to look at which ones do. In some cases, when I have, there haven't. And I agree, I've been surprised at that number is as low as it is. I think a large part of it is the difference between the national scope of key biodiversity areas and the primarily provincial scope of ecological reserves. Provincial listings, so red and blue lists that the CDC recognizes, subnational ranks by NatureServe are not part of the key biodiversity area aspects, because we're relating it to either the national scale or provincial scale. Quite often that takes things out of consideration that just doesn't meet the criteria.
And the second part of the question is, it concerns me that the emphasis is on species and biodiversity, when the real problems, I think, are ecosystem related. Now, you did mention that there's some ecosystem emphasis as well, but I'm wondering why there isn't more on ecosystems, because surely that's what's threatened more than species.
That's a good question, and yes, I agree. My job, if my colleague Lucy Poley was giving this presentation, it would probably have a very different focus on it. She's our ecosystems coordinator. She covers all of Canada. Although she is getting some help, we have some other people hired on to look at ecosystems specifically in other part of the province. BC is still, we are lagging in the ecosystem KBA aspects because of that disconnect in how we map and measure what ecosystems are. The Garry Oak ecosystem has been looked at, and the threshold, the math comes out to about 3 square kilometers of intact Garry Oak ecosystem to meet the threshold of KBA status. There aren't many portions of, aren't many 3 square kilometer contiguous parts of Garryoak ecosystem left. Unfortunately, there are a few, but that's there. I suspect things like the South Okanagan will meet KBA criteria for the Great Basin for that sagebrush, possibly antelope bitterbrush type ecosystems. Elsewhere in the province, probably as well, but that is down the road, unfortunately, at this point.
Anyone else have a question? I was wondering how much uptake you've had from the Indigenous community. I know you met with the Métis today, and you mentioned Haida Gwaii.
Yes, when we have a couple people that are leading the outreach and engagement with nations. Every KBA that we work on goes through, it has an opportunity for who have a territory that it lies in. We've had I'm trying to think of almost no nations bands that have not really been either at least approving of KBAs or supporting it. Ranges from very strong excitement about, hey, what can these do to us, to, yeah, every little bit helps. So certainly there is interest in it. Quite often with the advent of Indigenous protected and conserved areas that many nations are looking at around in their territories, KBAs help strengthen that argument. We don't expect that we'll come in and say, hey, here's something you didn't know about in your territory. They know those values are there for the most part, almost invariably. But having this designation that both provincial and federal governments fully recognize really helps lend the strength in their applications for IPCAs.
Yeah, one of the difficulties I've had in the past engaging with First Nations is that they often don't have the capacity to look at biological issues, though they're interested in. If we're able to provide funding so they can hire somebody, and they've always been very responsive. But
and certainly that is what we offer, that they're offered to given every opportunity to be as involved in the process as possible. But being said, that we'll take it from here and work on the proposal process is great because it doesn't impinge on their capacity issues. And it also isn't the fact that it doesn't come with managed prescriptions. It doesn't come necessarily with protections. It's a very different vehicle that way from SARA. SARA is often a 4-letter word for many because it imposes, because reserves in particular are deemed federal land, and there's prescribed how they are supposed to look after the species. Species at risk values are often highest on reserve lands because they have looked after them quite well, unlike off-reserve lands, which the rest of us have done. So the fact that we can say these values are here, but the management and how those are stewarded is left up to the landowner, in this case, would be the bands and communities.
Maybe a couple of questions for you, Ian. I don't think they're related. One is prioritization in the process for, it looks like there would be more candidates and you've got time likely in identifying. And then second, representation. Are you considering representation? So ecological reserves are based on a representative collection. Is that part of the KBAs?
To a certain extent, yes. To be frank, the phrase "low-hanging fruit" is commonly used in our work, and in part really the ones that are perhaps the most obvious and the most easily moved through. But that said, the intent is to eventually get around to everything. So that's probably going to take a lot more time, but certainly in my work, I've not set out necessarily. I haven't said, okay, I need to go up to the piece and find something here or go there, around the province. But certainly to a certain extent, I have tried to spread the effort around the province and ensure that there are opportunities equally throughout the province. That said, when you look at the dots, they are heavily weighted to the south, and that's not just a BC thing. There's an ecological basis for that as well. When you get into the broad, the boreal in particular, A, there's lower diversity, and B, just more homogeneous ecosystems means that there's less opportunities for unique or special characteristics that are there. BC's very dynamic, very heterogeneous map throughout the mountainous parts and onto the coast leaves lots more opportunities for that. Nationally, of course, species that just sneak over the 49th parallel into across the Canada-US border, whether that's in BC in the South Okanagan, Southern Vancouver Island, Lower Mainland, here in the Kootenays, Boundary District, and even across the prairies and into Southern Ontario. Those are areas where we get a bit more unique aspects for national. So there is certainly a disproportionate number of KBAs towards the south versus the north. So there we do have one criterion that I didn't touch on, that was criterion C, which is ecological integrity. This is a site that the Secretariat is still working out the criteria nationally for that. The intent there are large landscape scale sites, 10,000 square kilometers or more, of representative ecosystems, and this would get to the representation side because they are looking at 1 or 2 per each ecosystem type or biome type, where you have minimal industrial footprint. So where that ecosystem is most intact. So those are very much likely in the northern parts of every province. So that will hopefully eventually see in northern BC.
Thanks, that helps, yeah.
Took me a while to get around to that part on the answers.
Yeah.
I have a comment. I was just thinking, following up on what Gary said, sort of a comment, because our ecological reserves, most of them are fairly small or tiny, actually. And yet, while representational, they're also seen as this is enough to protect whatever. When in reality, when you look at the criteria for a KBA, for example, they couldn't possibly meet it. And yet, and looking at representational with ecological integrity, the way you're describing, certainly, as you said, in the South, the impacts are enormous. And the surrounding land is so heavily impacted by industry that there's only these tiny little elements left. And I wonder if there was any way of sort of recognizing these tiny little remnants as really important in a significant way, even if they wouldn't meet, say, KBA.
Yep. A lot. There are very small KBAs. A lot of again, city parks in Victoria that support some of the rare plants associated with Garry Oak ecosystems, whether that's McCown's meadowfoam on the beach areas, or some of the more upland meadow, Garry Oak meadow type plants, certainly are eligible to be KBAs. There's no minimum size, it's where those values are. And if a site is able to maintain just a tiny portion of that, that is fine. They're not necessarily designed to mean that the site, that the species is even viable, is as a viable population there. There is a minimum threshold that of an abundance, so that is intended to be, so if one bird shows up in a site that doesn't necessarily make it a KBA, you need some regularly occurring aspect of that. But for the most part, yeah, some of those smaller sites do show up as KBAs. And are they going to ensure that that site continues, that species doesn't go extinct or extirpated? That is not necessarily the point of the KBA. The point is that is there now, and it does merit some level of protection and or stewardship to make sure that it continues.
Thank you.
And Jenny, we have considered that KBAs maybe an opportunity to have a relatively small ecological reserve embedded within a larger area, particularly of private land, that we couldn't actually do previously if just the province was designating it. So yeah, right. We're looking forward to having those smaller areas expanded.
I'm warden for the Sitka River Ecological Reserve, so it's a bog and a bit of the forest up there, but it's that whole valley has been incredibly decimated. Yeah. So and looking at, say, Roosevelt Elk up there, I was thinking that we have a wildlife habitat area right next to the ecological reserve, which has a given life future, but maybe something like a KBA, as you say, combining some of these other proximity areas might work and give it a bit more status, recognition, even whatever.
They're not intended certainly to be the be all and end all of conservation. It's one in a suite of conservation tools out there to help maintain things. Each of these is a bit different. A wildlife habitat area is a bit different from an ecological reserve, from a key biodiversity area, from an environmentally sensitive area, development permit area within municipal planning. So it's the KBA is intended to be an information source of this value occurs here. I sometimes refer to it as like a pirate map of here be values. This is where it is species that meet the criteria of key biodiversity areas are known to be in sufficient abundance that they meet those thresholds.
Yeah, the question is in terms of the Conservation Data Center, and I'm sure you are working fairly closely with them. Do they come to you and say this area is really special and should be considered for a KBA? And how complete do you think their records are around important species in BC?
To date, they've not come to us. They're certainly very cooperative, responsive, and work regularly with the staff at the Conservation Data Center. They are not as yet coming to us. They have their own capacity issues, certainly. So we don't expect them to do that. But yeah, certainly pretty helpful. That said, when we are talking about species, they will say, hey, this thing occurs over here or whatever, or this site. So when we are talking, certainly they will potentially offer other sites or potential areas like that. Are there data? The data is, some things are very good. There's some aspects of Garry Oak Meadows, Southern Okanagan, some of the priority conservation areas are maintained quite well. I think when you get into lesser areas, they're not quite so much kept up to date. That's a capacity and funding issue. There's a lot of information that comes in, and it's not always that they have to set their own priorities of what they look at. But yeah, some of it is quite meticulously kept updated. So it really depends on where you are in the province.
Now, just thinking how great it might be if Conservation Data Center, KBA work, and Friends of Ecological Reserve all focused on a particular area and said this really needs to be, potentially an ecological reserve, and a KBA might have some influence with government.
Well, certainly that could be one application, and that's certainly the intent. Not necessarily the intent, but one of the potential outcomes of the KBA work, and particularly why both province and federal governments are looking to it for their own 30 by 30 commitments, is identifying sites that may have not really appeared as obvious protected area candidates and opportunities to move it forward. I'll go back to Trout Creek again, and that site is the actual delineation of that we have expands beyond the ecological boundaries. I was in the Okanagan, part of why I chose that, and actually had those pictures from the Trout Creek because I was in there a couple of weeks ago and spent a bit of time there with Don Caton. And as we went from parking lot of the golf course that's immediately beside it and walked our way towards the ecological reserve boundaries, there was the woody pod milk vetch on the ground that's on municipal land that is in between. And Don was talking about how he'd been talking to District of Summerland, that this is conservation value, strong conservation value, probably also fairly high economic value for housing right beside golf courses where we know subdivisions like to go in and are pretty high value. So he's talked to the Summerland Council there quite a bit, and there is interest in having recognition of those of the conservation values. So that KBA, because that milk, the woody pod milk vetch does occur on those municipal lands, that KBA now comes over, and hopefully Don and others that are, and the warden and other people that champion that area are able to take that to city council and use that as extra incentive to say, yes, this should be that, just potential opportunities, perhaps even to expand the ecological reserve boundaries out towards that. What that entails, that's not my job, but certainly that the recognition of either expanding those boundaries or finding completely new areas that might be valuable as ERs.
Ian, it's Jenny. First of all, thank you for doing this talk. It's very interesting. I was wondering if there were some examples of KBAs that are on private land, and also if there are examples of KBAs that capture wildlife corridors, like migration corridors or corridors for movement.
Two great questions. Yes, we do have KBAs on private land. The Nanaimo Lakes, which is Vancouver Island marmot, everyone's poster child for species at risk in Canada, is almost entirely on private land, owned by, it's managed by Mosaic Forest Industries. It's on behalf of, I'm not sure if it's Western Forest Products, Interfor, whoever that part of the island is, but it is large, almost entirely private land. It's also a ecological reserve that's in
Haley Lake Ecological Reserve is there.
Yes, Haley Lake, yeah. Encompasses that, but that is on private land. If I go back to that lower, the Lower Fraser Delta KBA, encompasses a good portion of the city of Richmond, which of course is large parts of private land. So, and there's lots of other opportunities, lots of other places where it does go onto private land. In most cases, there are just, the other one that I think of is on Saturna, Mount Warburton Pike, Mount Fisher is KBA on some bluff ecosystem types there, and a large part of that is private land. Where it covers multiple landowners, we don't reach out to the landowners. Again, it doesn't, the pros and cons of not having protection, not having a management prescription. Downside is it's not protected. The upside is it's a little more, it's certainly a lot more palatable to landowners when you tell them that, yeah, we're not going to tell you how to manage this species, or you can't manage your land unless you look after the species. Hopefully they view it as a positive for that, but you can imagine we did not reach out to every landowner in the city of Richmond as to determine if they were okay with this being a KBA. So that is that aspect. For what corridors, connectivity comes up a few times, and I would say it's one of the, there's a couple aspects of KBAs to me are missing. One is that connectivity value. So I think if you had that an opportunity to protect the connectivity, that would help quite a bit. Another shortcoming to me is Indigenous cultural values in particular, and that's brought up when we talk to First Nations. Is there's species, particularly plants and medicines that are very important to them that may not necessarily meet an ecological benchmark for KBAs, but are still an important area for it. And a couple of certainly, quite often with nations that when bands talk about having a cultural aspect, a cultural criteria for KBAs as well, which I think would be an interesting aspect to look at.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian.
So, Ian, if I might, that to me came sort of led to another link. At some point, it might be great if the work that you're doing, and particularly if a KBA is on private land, that you then share that information with Andrew Day from the Parks Foundation, who, of course, have money to purchase private land for conservation. So it could be really helpful for that relationship, if it's not already there, to be established between your work and the Parks Foundation's work.
Well, it's a good point out there. I'll certainly look into that. I know one of our major funders is for the work in BC that has been going on has been Sitka Foundation, and they've been large funders for the Parks, BC Parks Foundation, and with the focus of finding out where we can have more parks and protected areas, whether that's parks, conservancies, ERs, etc., around the province. So I think that connection probably is there, but that's certainly something I can ask about with the people, the national secretariat level, who are working more on those types of interactions.
I just noticed that one of the problems when I write notes is that even I can't read my own handwriting, but I was going to acknowledge Wayne Stetsky as our liaison to the BC Park Elders, who are a group that's been helpful to us and has a tremendous amount of knowledge.
Yes, great time. Wayne had mentioned that. Yes, that he was fulfill that role. So
I have another question. I'm curious as to why the place like that has the only elephant seal breeding colony in Canada would not have been automatically included.
Mm-hmm. That one is, and I know you, Gary, you did a technical review for Race Rocks, and that one has been a big frustration for me because that Iceland gull popped up as a trigger, what we call trigger species that meet criteria thresholds for KBAs.
But now they've changed the name of the Iceland gull.
But yes, at any rate, it has been, there's some people that get technical reviews back immediately. We've had some the same day. This one has languished forever. Everybody's busy and stuff, but it is, Race Rocks is still very much, it will be a KBA. So it's on its way. That is an example of a KBA, because elephant seals are not listed, but because it is the only site in Canada where they have pups, as it's a criterion, that criterion D, those biological processes, as is a site that is very much a KBA. So it's coming.
Okay. And since Linda Kennedy is there with us, she might be interested in why are there any areas with rattlesnake protection?
Yes. Yep. Rattlesnakes is very much is also that one. Another site that is, actually I was working on Kalamalka Park today. So Kalamalka Park, Coldstream Ranch outside Vernon is a rattlesnake KBA. Marcus, his last name just left me. I sent him an email today, who is a grad student, just finished up work with rattlesnakes at Kalamalka Park. Is Marcus Atkins, was helping out with that, with lots of data that was available. So that will be one. We are looking at the big one for me is the South Okanagan. Most KBAs have one or two trigger species within them. There's a few sites, Waterton, Point Pelee, that have a couple dozen of trigger species within them. The South Okanagan, currently we're at about 50. So it's, as you can imagine, so that currently we have a site that pretty much goes from Penticton south to the border and incorporates most of the ecosection, the valley bottom there, the ponderosa pine bunchgrass beck zones. That is, and certainly is the heart of rattlesnake areas. We're also looking at the boundary where you get lots of rattlesnakes and other parts as well. But yes, absolutely looking at all the rattlesnake, gopher snake, desert night snake is there in the South Okanagan. The racer are all very much on our radar.
Mm-hmm. Linda, are you satisfied with that? Linda's our Ecological Reserve Warden for Campbell Brown.
Campbell Brown.
Campbell Brown, yes, and that is actually, I was talking with Mike, the fellow who didn't work with that.
Mike Dunn?
Yes, Mike Dunn, about it's currently drafted as a, whether there's enough, if actually I might be in contact with you afterwards, if you want to send me an email or something, I'll put that in the chat, my email address as well. But yeah, it'd certainly be great to talk with you about just updated information about rattlesnake numbers and things that are at Campbell Brown, because it's one that currently is drafted as a KBA.
Yeah, we haven't done any work in there now for three years, and it's hard to estimate the numbers.
They're tough species to work with.
They are
not just because they're rattlesnakes, but and not just because picking them up is a bit dangerous. But yeah, they're tough to get numbers on. The metrics we use are, we have what we call the assessment parameter. There's a number of different, when we talk about does it meet threshold, the percentage of the population, we measure population in a number of different ways. It can be number of mature individuals. That's the best, sort of the gold standard of what we want, but we recognize that we don't always know the number of individuals. And in some cases, particularly plants, that number can fluctuate hugely year to year. The annual variation in some annual plants is massive, orders of magnitude. So it's not the appropriate one. So we can do it by range. We can do it by number of localities. So the element occurrences, things that like when I was talking with the milk pod, the woody pod milk vetch at Trout Creek as being one of 10 occurrences. 3 of them are probably historical. So that counts as a population. So there's a number of different ways when we talk about percentage of a population, a number of different ways that we can measure that.
Well, and the other thing is that Cal Lake Park is a much bigger area and has, sorry about that, has a bigger area and has historically had a much larger